Welcome to Brain Health Matters, a podcast dedicated to helping you connect with the people and resources that will help you improve your memory, boost your brain, and reduce the risk of developing dementia. This week, we tackle mold, parasites, and inflammation, and learn ways to turn off their threats to the health of our brains. Stay tuned.
Brain Health Matters is brought to you by Don't Let the Memories Fade. Learn many enjoyable ways to enhance body, mind, and spirit with simple lifestyle changes that will help you improve your memory and your mind. You can create a healthier, more vibrant future with Don't Let the Memories Fade. Available in ebook and paperback on Amazon everywhere.
Hi, I'm Kate Kunkel. I'm your host here for Brain Health Matters, and today I'm joined by Evan Brand. He is a certified functional medicine practitioner and functional nutrition therapy practitioner who has transformed the lives of thousands of clients with his online practice. He finds and fixes the root causes of fatigue, depression, anxiety, digestive, and other issues, all of which affect our brains. Evan solved his own health struggles using the same advanced lab testing strategies and protocols that he now uses in the clinic. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us, Evan.
My pleasure, Kate.
So you have been doing this quite a while. Your website is full of amazing reviews. So obviously you're a man who knows what's going on. You have a long list of conditions that you can help people overcome, and they seem pretty disparate to the layperson. Like, what is the connection between brain fog and, say, ulcerative colitis?
Sure. Well, many people may have heard the term the gut-brain axis, or they've heard that your gut is your second brain. And that's because a lot of your nutrients are made, like specifically B as in Bravo, B vitamins are made in your intestinal tract. You make the majority of your serotonin and possibly others as more research comes out. Neurotransmitters are made in the gut too. So when we talk about anxiety and depression and poor cognitive function and lack of energy and drive and focus and memory issues, a lot of that is actually stemming from the gut. But when you go to a neurologist, for example, they're only trained on a disease model of brain health, meaning until you have the diagnosis of dementia or Parkinson's, there's really not much they're going to do for you in terms of preventative medicine. And I've seen many people that have come to me for a second or a third or a 20th, opinion, and they have brain issues, they have depression, they have anxiety, they have fatigue, they have brain fog. And the first place we look is their gut. And I will use specific nutrients like amino acids and other things to help the brain. There's certain things we can do to increase blood flow in the brain, like the microcirculation. There's nutrients we can use to help with acetylcholine and dopamine and serotonin and endorphins, which are all different types of brain chemicals. But a lot of the bang for our buck comes from looking at the gut and then fixing the issues we find there. So this could include viruses, parasites, bacterial overgrowth, candida, fungal overgrowth. Our guts are typically a mess in the modern world because glyphosate is everywhere. Even the CDC admitted 80% of all humans tested have glyphosate residue in their body. This is a pesticide that was marketed under the name Roundup from Monsanto for years until Bayer bought them, and there's not a patent on it anymore. So Roundup is in so many different products, whether it's in your food supply or whether it's in the grass seed. People buy products like what's called weed and feed, which is a toxic stew of different chemicals mixed with grass seed to put it on their lawns. Then their children play on this and get poisoned topically. You can breathe it in living near agricultural areas. And then, of course, you can eat it or you can drink it. And so we're in a society now where you may have the diagnosis of ulcerative colitis, but you also have brain fog and depression and anxiety. And if you go through the conventional model, you go to the psychiatrist for the anxiety and depression. You get the anti-anxiety medication, which does nothing to fix your gut, and it just numbs you. Then you go to the gastroenterologist for the ulcerative colitis. You're going to get some sort of possibly a steroid or maybe some immune suppressant drug to try to stop the autoimmune attack on your intestines. But none of that actually fixes what's driving it. And we know that based on 1,000+ cases I've seen, thousands more of lab tests I've looked at, and I coach doctors and other practitioners how to do this stuff. We know that there's certain bacteria that can actually trigger autoimmune diseases in the gut. So we're always running a DNA stool test on everyone.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought up that because I wanted to hit that next because a lot of people don't understand that we can actually tell how healthy our gut is. And you said about a test. What is that? And how can you tell what's in your gut, creating all these issues?
Sure. So there's a lot of different ones out there now in the natural functional health world, a lot of good competitor products, but the one I like the best is out of Georgia, and it's called Diagnostic Solutions Lab. I've used them for years. They run a test called a GI map, which is a DNA sample. So conventional medicine is still using something called antigen-based testing. It's about 20 to 30 years outdated, and it misses a lot of infections. And so with a high level of accuracy, with a DNA sample you can do at home, you poop in a tray, scoop it in the tube, you get it back to the lab. We can look for many different infections, whether we're talking E. coli, Campylobacter, Salmonella, Giardia, which is a parasite, Crypto, cytomegalovirus. We can look Blastocystis hominis, Dentamoeba fragilis. We can look at Klebsiella, which is a bacteria. We know that causes Hashimoto's and potentially other autoimmune diseases. We can look at Citrobacter, which can cause autoimmunity in the gut. So you can look at fat digestion. You can look at gut inflammation, pancreatic elastase, secretory IgA, so we can measure what the immune system is doing based on all these infections. And that's done with just one stool sample. So
Wow. So does that tell you the variety also? Because a lot of people talk about the microbiome, and I'd like you to address that as well. But does that test can also tell you then how healthy the range of bacteria is that you want in there?
yeah, precisely. So there is what's called normal flora, or some call these commensal bacteria, and we're outnumbered by microbial cells. So like human cells compared to microbial cells, we've got way more microbes so we are essentially a microbe creature than we are a skin and bones creature. And that fact is important because many people, they don't take care of themselves, meaning they're not filtering their water, they're showering in toxic water, they're drinking toxic water, they're doing alcohol, which is destructive to the gut. They're doing conventional food, like a non-organic strawberry. The Environmental Working Group found there's an average of 22 different pesticides on a conventionally grown strawberry. I still get frustrated because it really needs to be called chemical. When you go to the grocery and it says like conventional or organic, it really needs to say chemical. And it's just wrong because even trace amounts of glyphosate, for example, damages these good microbes in the gut. So to answer your question, yes, you can measure the good microbes, and those good microbes often get damaged by these chemicals in the food supply. And also, we know that a lot of depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue problems, they stem directly from the gut. So I had one woman who came to me, her name was Miranda, and she had depression for over 20 years. We looked at her gut. It was a mess. I did not give her any antidepressant herbs, which sometimes I do. I'll give rhodiola, which is an adaptogen, or I'll give some B vitamins or maybe some tyrosine to help. I didn't give her any of that. All we simply did was we gave her some antimicrobial herbs to address what we found in her gut. And on the 6-week follow-up, her depression was 90% better. And she almost forgot. A lot of people forget how bad they were when they started. And I asked her, like, about how's your depression? She says, well, what depression? I'm like, do you realize how crazy this is? You've been depressed for 20 years. All we did is work on your gut. You're not depressed anymore. That's crazy. And there's not much money in this for the pharmaceutical industry. Mm-hmm. So there's not really going to be much study on this. You're not going to see it on headline news. XYZ herb that fixes XYZ bacteria reverses depression. You're not going to see that.
No, for sure. Let's go back to the chemicals because you are able also, I want to get into molds as well. So there's toxicity from chemicals, from molds, from parasites, from all of these things. So with these tests, can you also tell if there are molds or is that a different kind of a test? Because I've had a few of my own brain health clients recently who we've decided that it's mold that is really causing their issues. Can you tell that same thing from that test?
So the stool's where you're going to see all the different parasites, bacteria, worms, gut inflammation, but the urine is where you're going to get all the other valuable data. So urine and stool, you can pretty much cover your bases with that. So we use a company out of Kansas called Great Plains for that, and we often do a combo test. And so what that would be organic acids, which is where we look at mitochondrial function, meaning how well are you producing cellular energy. This is very important for the brain. You've got to have a lot of mitochondria pumping out ATP to fuel the heart, to fuel the brain. They're very energy intensive organs. So we look at mitochondrial function. Mitochondria, you could think of it maybe like your spark plugs in your vehicle. So this is what's really generating that spark of energy that the body uses to then power you, whether it's swimming or focusing on work or whatever. You've got to have enough mitochondria to do that. Also, you've got to have good mitochondria for fertility. So look at the epidemic of infertility problems. When you look at, under a microscope, if you look at sperm, right underneath the head of a sperm that's going to swim in and hopefully fertilize an egg for a woman that wants to conceive, you've got a big old powerhouse mitochondria right there. The sperm's packed with mitochondria. And this is why we see such an epidemic of infertility, is because we do have so many chemicals. We do have so many mold toxins. The mitochondria are damaged. That therefore affects the sperm motility. And so a little bit of a side tangent, but with the organic acids test via urine, you can measure the mitochondrial function, and then you can measure brain chemistry. So we'll look at dopamine, serotonin, endorphins. We also look at nutrient levels. So if you have gut infections, we're going to see issues with vitamin C and B vitamins. And if you've got mold toxin, we're going to see you have low glutathione. That's also very important. That's the most powerful antioxidant next to melatonin. Very important to protect the brain from the onslaught of these chemicals. And then you can run a separate profile, meaning you pay the lab a little more money, you get another report, but it's the same cup of urine. It's a fasted urine sample. And you can run that through a toxic chemical profile where you can measure glyphosate and 2,4-D and xylene and benzene and gasoline additives and dry cleaning chemicals and plastics and hair products, hair dye products for women. You can measure acrylamide. So that's cool. But the mold toxins are really the most important. Some people don't want to spend, or they can't spend all the money on all of it. So, if someone says, hey, I want to do all of it, we'll run the oat, the myco, and the chemical profile all on one urine sample. But the reality is, if you've got mold toxins, you need a lot of help. So the detox protocol we'll create for mold will likely detox the chemicals. So even if we don't have the chemical report, we're still helping people find and treat things that they don't even see. But the mold is the big smoking gun for brain health, because we know that ochratoxin, which comes from aspergillus. Aspergillus is a mold that grows in water-damaged buildings. All of us have been exposed at one point, whether this was in childhood, in school, college, and beyond. We've probably lived or worked in a moldy building at one point. Aspergillus, it cannot bite other molds, so it essentially farts out toxins to help stake out its territory to eat that moldy drywall or whatever that baseboard was that got wet. We're the innocent bystander. We breathe in these mycotoxins. These have a direct impact on the brain because your sinus cavity, your olfactory bulb, very close to the brain. So you're breathing in these toxins. We know it directly depletes dopamine. So when we see why we're in a society that's addicted to social media and other things and coffee and stimulants and whatever, some of it's just because they have psychologists working at these social media companies to make the apps more addicting. But the other side of the coin is a lot of us have mold toxin. So I've seen this on paper. The vast majority of humans have low dopamine. So we're constantly seeking that quick fix of Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is. We want that quick fix. That's because we have low dopamine due to mold exposure. And the mold exposure, the problem is it actually promotes the overgrowth of bacteria and fungus in the gut. So for years clinically, I was using these herbal protocols. We were working on people's digestive problems because that's what was my story. I had IBS for as long as I could remember. My gut was a wreck. GI docs couldn't help, had to fix myself. But then what happened is some of these clients that had gut issues, they'd come back 2 to 3 months later and they still had gut issues that returned. And we'd go, that's interesting. So we'd rotate herbs, maybe add in some extra support, and they'd do well again, and then they'd relapse. And it wasn't until I got sick with mold that I figured this out. And now the lab tells you this. They'll tell you in fine print. For example, ochratoxin, they will tell you it promotes the overgrowth. This is almost verbatim to what the lab will tell you now, that mycotoxins promote the opportunistic bacterial overgrowth such as Clostridia and the yeast Candida. So what this means for people is that if you're using herbs to treat Candida, or you have yeast infections or jock itch or SIBO or whatever, you probably have mold. And that's the top priority. That's the top of the pyramid that's allowed these downstream issues with your gut to then affect your brain. So how does this all tie back in? Well, the mold damaged the brain directly. So some people can end up with vertigo because, for example, mycotoxins affect the cerebellum. Very important. Mold damages the kidneys, so you'll often see people diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, like the guy I just spoke to before I jumped on here with you. He's out of Canada, 75 years old, chronic kidney disease. He's had mold exposure. We don't have labs yet, but I'm going to bet you he's got mold toxin. And so you got the brain effect, you got the kidney effect, you got the gut effect because it's promoting the overgrowth. So I do believe when you are looking at brain health, I do believe mycotoxins should be one of the biggest top priorities, and hardly any neurologist, maybe one or two in the country, in the world, is even considering this.
And it's also like a mold can also cause, like my husband was exposed to mold in the old house he lived in, and he now has COPD from the mold. And we know that that's a fact. And I'm concerned that because we're having such a trouble fighting that, that it's also going to affect his brain at some point. Because if you're not getting enough oxygen, you're going to have brain issues.
That's a good point. Well, my advice for him, standard procedure and protocol for COPD, whether it's from chemical exposure or mold exposure, would be to do a nebulizer. And you want to put glutathione in there. So I would be doing glutathione and silver. We use what's called Argentin 23. That's like the professional silver. And I would mix those two together. We have a particular glutathione that's got some sodium bicarbonate, so it's a little more gentle on the lungs. So you could just do glutathione with saline, or you could do glutathione with silver. And I'd put that in the nebulizer for your husband. My mother-in-law, she was actually diagnosed COPD. She never smoked, so we knew it wasn't that, but she had a lot of chemical exposure, a lot of mold exposure. So I think it was that, but she's got COPD too. And of course, they give you an inhaler as standard procedure, but the nebulizer protocol, it works amazingly because the glutathione is actually going to open things up, but it'll also protect you too. So any of the toxins that he has, it's going to protect him. So, I mean, she says within 5-10 minutes, she's got relief.
Wow, that's awesome. So we've got now molds, we've got chemical toxins. Let's talk a little bit about parasites, because now I happen to live in Ecuador, and parasites are an issue here because the water in certain areas is not so good. People who come here who are used to a really clean environment, it's very different if you're used to it, and people who come and they're not used to that situation, they have big problems. So we think of that in terms of developing countries. But people in developed countries can also deal with this, yes?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that just irks me is when you go to a GI doc with issues. Maybe you've got chronic diarrhea and you suggest that you may have parasites. They'll ask you, well, did you go to Mexico? Did you go to Ecuador? Did you go to Bali? Did you go to Thailand? Like, where'd you go? And the reality is you don't have to go anywhere, because we are all international travelers with our food supply. Look at your blueberries. They might be from Chile. Look at your strawberries. They may be from Latin America. Look at your pineapple. It could be from Brazil. I mean, I've seen the food supply. Look at your avocados from Mexico. So we all are international travelers, even if we stay at home. And so that fact alone, I've seen so many parasites in people, myself included. I had not been out of the U.S., but yet I had Cryptosporidium and Giardia, which are two waterborne parasites that you would see in a developing country that has issues with water quality. And I didn't go anywhere. So surface water in the U.S. is highly contaminated with waterborne parasites. So lakes, rivers, creeks, streams, all these places that I loved swimming in as a kid, you get exposed to these things and you can develop these infections, which will chronically suppress the immune system and cause IBS. So when you get the IBS diagnosis, that is so generic. That doesn't mean anything. IBS really could be H. pylori. It could be Giardia, Crypto, Blasto, Dentamoeba, Klebsiella, Citrobacter, Pseudomonas, Morganella. It could be any of these. And so if you were getting that diagnosis, you need to just push further, and get the proper testing done, because let me tell you, in developed worlds, there's a ton of parasites. I see them every week. So this is not some rare thing. This is not some tropical thing. They'll try to refer you to the tropical disease, infectious disease specialist. All they're going to do is give you drugs. I'm not opposed to those. They can work very quickly, some of these medications, but I just prefer to do things naturally because that's what got me better. So my bias is going to be coming in and using more natural items and antimicrobial, anti-parasitic, antifungal herbs. We often use those together because if you're talking about parasites, usually if you have parasites, you probably have other problems too, meaning if you run a stool test, you might see parasites, but you also might see a lot of bacterial overgrowth as well, and you may see H. pylori, which is a very contagious bacteria. About 51% of the world population has H. pylori, and this bacteria, one of the mechanisms of action is it damages your parietal cells, which then reduce your ability to secrete HCl, which is your stomach acid. So now that your digestive fire has been turned down, when you go eat contaminated food, drink contaminated water, normally that HCl at adequate levels may have been enough to kill the pathogen. But now because you're developing what's called hypochlorhydria, that's low stomach acid, now these infections can grab hold and they can stay and they won't leave. So to me, that's a big important thing. I had H. pylori years ago along with parasites. I lost about 25 pounds without trying, and I didn't know what was wrong with me until I got the proper testing done. But it's a very scary thing when you eat a ton of food and you can't put on weight, and that was my situation. It was those infections. So yeah, parasites happen to me, and they happen to a lot of people, and the conventional testing for it, once again, is very, very insensitive, meaning there's a lot of potential for false negatives. This is why we do DNA testing, because it's much more accurate. So if you've, quote, been ruled out with your conventional testing, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. You could have just had an improper test done.
That's a really good point because, yeah, if they're not looking for it in the right way, then they're not going to find it. It's like anything else, right? You had a really cool video on your website with a fog machine. And this is something that fascinates me because so many people are living in a situation they can't leave, they can't move, and they have something with mold. You showed a piece of furniture, I believe, that had some mold in it. How does this fogger work to help eliminate this problem in your home?
Yeah, that might have been a demo video that I put up on my resource page. I've got a whole course that's called Better Home, and it's all about kind of creating your home oasis based on my experience of getting exposed to mold and building houses and renovating houses. I've done a lot in real estate, and so I've got a lot of experience about what you need to do and not do. So I put up a free video there to show that. And I've got a lot of flack for talking about fogging because many people say that this is not effective enough and that I'm sort of like misleading people. But the reality about fogging, our particular solution, a pharmacist formulated it years ago, and it's a blend of citrus seed oils. So it has lime, lemon, tangerine, and grapefruit. And these are very effective as antifungals. So they will kill mold, but they will also kill candida. Now, just the disclaimer for people is that, and for the naysayers, this will not be a complete remediation.
Okay.
If you have mold behind your walls, you've got to cut that out and replace it. No question. You're not going to be able to get fog behind the wall and treat that. So if you've had a water leak, a busted pipe or something where you've got wet insulation, wet studs, you've got surface mold growing in the wall cavity on the back of the paper of your drywall, you've got to cut that crap out and replace it. The fog is the final touch. So after you've had a good thorough inspection, you've had your ductworks inspected and cleaned, you've had insulation and drywall replaced, you've had, let's say, maybe under your kitchen cabinets, you've had water leak from your kitchen sink or your dishwasher or something. Maybe you had to rip up your subfloor. I don't know how bad your situation is, but once that's all fixed from a contractor perspective, then the final touch is you can do the fog. And the mechanism of action is it actually denatures the mold and denatures candida, meaning it takes this microscopic fragment of mold and it breaks it into extremely tiny fragments that are considered non-viable, and therefore your immune system will not react to that in most cases. Unless someone has a very sensitive situation called mastoactivation, you may still react. But in general, after you fog a building, as the final step, you would then come in with like a wet mop or a steam mop, and you can wipe things down. And then you can retest that environment. So we use Petri dishes, which will then very accurately show what's growing. It'll fall onto the Petri dish, and then you can tell with a pretty high level of accuracy. It's not perfect, but pretty high accuracy. You can get what's called a health score, and we've seen massive improvements. So the goal is 4 or less colonies of mold to be growing in your breathable air. We've seen people in double digits get down to single digits just with fogging alone. So in some cases, it's very effective. But if there's an active water leak, obviously you got to fix that and replace the stuff.
Yeah, it's just going to keep coming back. So let's talk a little bit about the symptoms of a mold exposure, because I have talked about this now several times with clients, but we've never addressed it here on the show. And I think it's something that would be valuable for people to know what they could be looking at. What kind of symptoms? Is that where you might have IBS, or is it something completely different?
Yeah, great question. I mean, really, mold and Lyme disease, they're kind of the great mimickers because many people don't recognize these symptoms as being related, and so they end up on some other medication. So, for example, brain fog. You brought up brain fog earlier. So, you go to your conventional doctor on that. At most, you're going to get a prescription for Adderall or Vyvanse or some other stimulant, usually a methamphetamine derivative like compound, to really increase alertness, and it does work, but it's not root cause. Root cause could be mold. So brain fog, you may have derealization, where you feel like you're dreaming. You may have disorientation. You may have dizziness. Full-blown vertigo is possible. You may have rashes, hives, food sensitivities, chemical sensitivities like fragrances bother you. You may have cold hands and cold feet because mold affects blood flow. You develop what's called hypercoagulation, meaning your blood flow is not as good. So brain fog could also be partly the issue from that too, poor blood flow. Erectile dysfunction, you'll see that in men. Same for women too. I mean, women still have erectile tissue, so you can have women that just have terrible sex lives because they don't have enough blood flow. Sinus problems, the conventional stuff you may think about, cough, shortness of breath could be common, blurry vision. So your vision may get blurry and then kind of clear up. So you may have intermittent blurred vision. I certainly had that. You can have floaters, anxiety, panic attacks. Suicidal thoughts can be possible. Homicide is possible. It's called mold rage. So I see a lot of children in my clinic, and a lot of these children have issues where they're getting in trouble at school because they're hitting and biting and kicking kids, and they're physically abusive. And a lot of these kids test positive for mold toxin. Even kids that are on the autism spectrum, a lot of those children have mold toxin as well. We've reversed many cases by simply detoxing mold. Chronic fatigue is the biggest one. So a guy named Dr. Brewer did a study. He had a chronic fatigue practice. 96% of his chronic fatigue patients had at least one mycotoxin in the urine. So to me, the link between chronic fatigue and mold is there, and I certainly experienced it for myself. Maybe last but not least, issues with your blood pressure and heart. So heart palpitations, atrial flutter, AFib is possible, weakness, aches, arthritis-like pains, muscle cramps.
Wow, it's like everything. Like there are so many
Yeah,
things that could be the symptoms of of mold exposure.
yeah, frequent urination, waking up at night to go pee. They blame it on hormones and age. It's typically mold toxin. You can reverse that. I was up 4 or 5 times a night to go pee. I no longer do that. My kidneys have recovered. My kidneys were damaged from ochratoxin. So, yeah, this is the great mimicker. That's what I'm telling you.
Jeez. So that is something that we can work on. Like there are steps you can take. So you can remediate your home. That's step one. What's the first thing you would try to do?
Well, the first step is when you do the organic acids test, you need to figure out if you're colonized or not, because that's a very important distinction to make because that changes the protocol completely. So what that means is when you've been exposed to mold for long enough, or this is just my assumption here, but I've seen it enough clinically that I'm pretty confident with this. When you've been exposed to mold long enough, or there was a large enough amount of it, or you came into this moldy environment, this moldy office, building, dorm, whatever, with a weakened immune system, maybe by parasites or bacteria or something else, the mold then basically grabs hold of you and you become colonized, meaning that you're now growing mold in your sinus cavity and or your gut. So you're essentially a mold factory. And the reason that's so important is because if you're just using detox support, such as activated charcoal, to do what's called binding, where you're grabbing onto the mycotoxins in your body and then pulling it out through the stool, you also pee out mycotoxins, which is why you can measure it in the urine. So your kidneys are helping filter it, your stool and your bile, you're also dumping it out that way. But when you have, say, mold colonization, you can test for it on the oat test. If you're growing it, now you need antifungals up the nose and in the gut, because even if you move out of that moldy environment, you're taking the mold with you, and you will still generate mycotoxins on your own. So it'd be the equivalent of doing detox without killing the mold is kind of like opening the bathtub drain and you didn't turn off the water.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
killing the colonization would be turning off the water, and then the second step would then be binding it up. And depending on what mycotoxins you have, you may use different nutrients to help with that. So if you've got ochratoxin, which is very common, activated charcoal works very good at binding that up. But if you've got something called zearalenone, which is a highly estrogenic mycotoxin, it causes a lot of hormone imbalances and infertility and miscarriages in women, that is more bound up by clay. So we likely use a combination product that has clay and charcoal and other binders all in one capsule. And this is taken, usually I recommend it at night before bed on an empty stomach, or sometimes in the morning away from food and supplements, so it can do its job.
Evan, you are just a wealth of information. You're like a walking encyclopedia. I want to ask you about something that has become kind of controversial in the last couple of years, and that's ivermectin, because we know that it works. It's been used for decades for anti-parasites, for anti-parasitical. But what else can we use that for? Can that be used to help with any other toxins?
Yeah, well, of course, the big C word that a lot of the YouTube channels and stuff ban. We know it's been amazing for that. We've saved a ton of lives using it for that. I did a whole podcast with one of the world's best pulmonologist, ICU physicians named Dr. Pierre Corey. And the podcast was titled The War on Ivermectin. So I would highly encourage people to check that one out. That's been one of the most downloaded episodes over 10 years of doing podcasting. That's one of the top 5. And for me, it's been very beneficial personally, too, because of my history with tick bites and some of these tick-borne infections I've had. We know that it's very anti-inflammatory, so it can be great for inflammation in the gut and the brain, I believe. Also, joints. I noticed my joints felt better with it. My energy was incredibly better. I probably doubled or tripled my energy levels after using it. Some of that could have been long-haul symptoms that I was suffering and didn't know it until I fixed it. Also, I had a little bit of chest tightness and shortness of breath. Ivermectin cleared it up very quickly. And it's very cheap. It is on the World Health Organization's essential medication list due to its importance. And it's in every pharmacy there is because it has to be. It's on the mandatory medication list. And it's extremely cheap. Even where you are, I believe you can buy it over the counter for as little as probably $1 a dose or maybe even cheaper.
$1.31. Yeah, that's what it is here. Yeah, because I think what's important for people to understand is that we have these many tools that are really inexpensive and they can make a huge difference in our lives. If you're riddled with parasites or some such thing, this can help, and it's just a big savings.
Yeah, I had that client I told you about in Canada this morning with the kidney disease. I didn't want to go too into the woods on it on our first appointment, but I saw that he had at least 4 injections. And when you look into the research on this and you look up acute chronic kidney disease, it's in the literature now. And this guy, a year ago, perfect kidney function, no major change, no moldy buildings, nothing. And all of a sudden, that's what's happening. And, they're talking about dialysis and putting you on the transplant list and all this. And so, obviously we know, and Dr. Corey and I talked about this a little bit. We know that ivermectin can bind to spike protein. So this can be very, very beneficial for people that have had natural infection or that have had injections and they're suffering. And so I don't prescribe it. I can't. But this is something that people can get access to if, like you're in a country where you can just buy it, or hopefully your doctor will listen to your concerns, look at the studies on it. And there's a website, C19ivermectin.com. You can look at it. There's almost 100 studies now proving its benefits. And in regards to fatigue, I think that's one of the biggest things I've seen is people that just didn't fully recover from the virus that are just exhausted and they have brain fog.
Yeah, they call it COVID brain, and it's so sad. I mean, I'm a graduate of Dr. Daniel Amen's protocols and everything, and he has a course now actually on dealing with it because it's so common for people.
Yeah, I follow Amen, and I know he talks a lot about amino acids, which are great, but at a certain point you may need a little more. So I've done amino acids for years like him, though, with tyrosine and 5-HTP, and there's other things you can do to support the brain. So even if that medication is off limits for you, there's still many, many other things that you can do. So I just encourage people that you just have to keep moving forward. You got to make sure that you're fixing all these other pieces to the puzzle. There's not one smoking gun that breaks you. The question is, okay, well, if that infection did put you down, well, why did it put you down where someone else recovered? And that's where you need to do some digging.
Oh, I agree 100%. We need to understand that we are holistic. Everything is connected. You can't, everything has to be working well to protect you from whatever assault is coming at you, whether it's mold or a virus or whatever it is. Evan, how can people work with you? Because I know after this, there are going to be people who want to tap into your wisdom.
Sure. So I do one-on-one consults, and I have another functional medicine provider on my staff. My website, Evan Brand, EVAN, and last name Brand, like brand name, BRAND. That has all the details, so you can go there. And I do offer 15-minute free calls. I do that once a week. Try to listen to people for 15 minutes at no charge and hear what's going on, determine if I can help. And then I also have functional medicine training courses too. These are for practitioners also. A lot of practitioners take them. Medical docs, naturopaths, acupuncturists take them. But many students are just regular people that want to feel better. And basically what I've done is I got begged to do this, and I finally did it, and people loved it, which is I just basically showed a bunch of case studies. Hey, here's Sally. She had brain fog and fatigue and PMS and irritability and no sex drive, and her thyroid wasn't working. And here's what we ran. Here's her labs. Here's the protocol we used. Here's the follow-up labs. Here's the results. And I put some educational stuff in there too, but a lot of it's very hands-on, very clinical, somewhat geeky. But people can look at that and they can compare their own case and their own labs to what they see, and then they can get themselves better. So those are on my website also.
Perfect. And you said a podcast?
Yeah, I have a podcast. It's just called The Evan Brand Show. That's been on the air since 2012. So over a decade of episodes. There's maybe close to 500 episodes.
Wow.
So there's a lot of free content, and that's everywhere.
Perfect.
I will
make sure.
Google, Stitcher.
I will make sure there's a link on the show notes so that people can tap into that, especially the one on Ivermectin. I think that's really, I did listen to that one, and I think it's really important for people to pay attention. Evan, you are a treasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're really busy, and I appreciate very much you sharing with everyone here at Brain Health Matters.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. You asked great questions, so I really enjoyed it.
Good, thanks. You've been listening to the Brain Health Matters podcast, created and hosted by Kate Kunkel. You'll find more episodes along with the latest brain health research on our website at brainhealthmatters.today. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and if there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, let us know. We'll see if we can't find someone who can talk about it. And your help getting the word out is also appreciated by writing a review, subscribing, or sharing our podcast. Thanks again for joining us. See you next week.
You have 86 billion reasons to go vegan, and they're all resting right between your ears. That's right, 86 billion neurons that make up the master controller we call our brains. And while they're in control, our lifestyle choices determine how well they work, and that means we must nurture and protect them. The best way to do that? With a whole foods vegan diet that nurtures not just the physical, but also the emotional, mental, and spiritual brain. In the vegan brain, you'll learn how whole plant foods can nurture the healthiest version of yourself, and, perhaps more importantly, how your choices can reduce suffering for countless animals and help create a more compassionate, sustainable world. The Vegan Brain Second Edition also includes nutritious recipes and meal plans so that your journey towards a kinder, healthier future will be easy and delicious. Available in ebook format on Amazon.